Hello everyone, Jules here. Today I'd like to talk about quite a unique book that is about the Arthurian mythos, and it's called Arthurian Magic by John and Caitlin Matthews, and it's quite a thick book. As you can see, it's about 600 pages. This book was published by Llewellyn in 2017. So I want to talk about this book today. It's quite a unique book. It's called Arthurian Magic, but it's not quite the usual type of magic that most people would necessarily have in mind. The subtitle is A Practical Guide to the Wisdom of Camelot. So this book is not only about the Arthurian mythos, it's also about the legends of Merlin, and it's also about the myths and legends of the Grail. So this book is really an extension of a couple of other previous books. So I'll just talk about the previous books for a moment before I talk about the main book. Arthurian Magic, the large book, is really an extension and expansion of the complete Arthurian Tarot. This is the guidebook that came with the 25th anniversary edition, and this edition and tarot deck has recently been reissued, and that is with a purple cover, and I do have that version as well. I do have that new reissue. This is actually complete in itself, but this larger book is an extension and expansion, and it gives more background information to the legends. So this 25th anniversary edition was published in 2014, and that is the 25th anniversary edition. So the first one came out in about 1990, something like that. The original book, the very original Arthurian Tarot course, is the one that I worked through a number of years ago. This is the original. This is the first Arthurian Tarot course that came out, and this really is a tarot course. I did work through this book. I found it completely engaging and very thorough. It really is a tarot course, and this was written by Caitlin Matthews. And the book that came out with the Arthurian Tarot originally was called Hello Quest. And then there was this separate Arthurian Tarot course book. So that was published, this was published quite a while ago, 1993. So this was just a couple of years after the actual Arthurian Tarot was published. And then 25 years later, there is the complete Arthurian Tarot, which is actually the same, basically the same tarot course book, but this was issued with the tarot deck. And as I was saying, there is a reissue of this book. It's exactly the same book with a purple cover recently, and that's been issued with the Arthurian Tarot deck. So I wanted to mention all of that first. I wanted to mention the background because there's people who have this book or the reissue with the purple cover, and so that is really the newer version of the original Arthurian Tarot course from 1993. So that's that. But as I was saying, this Arthurian Magic book, I will talk about what's in the book in a moment. This is really for people who particularly have done the Arthurian Tarot course. I'm calling it the Arthurian Tarot course because that's what it really is. If you have already done that, it's actually called Hello Quest, a yearly Hello Quest. If you have done that, then I think you may be interested, particularly interested in this book, because it is such an expansion and extension of the Arthurian Hello Quest. So it's for people who are interested in that, and I'm interested in this book for that reason, because the Hello Quest, it's just so interesting. But I also have the Grail Tarot by John and Caitlin Matthews, and there is a review of the Grail Tarot on my channel, the tarot reviews, if people who would like to have a look at that. So this is about the myths and legends, all of the background stories that's all based on. But it's not only the Arthurian Tarot, it's also the Grail Tarot, and it's also got the myths and legends of Merlin in here too, because I'm also quite interested in Llewellyn as an archetypal figure. So now to talk about what's in this book. I'm really impressed with this book. The rituals that are in here, by the way, are group rituals, but you could modify that for solitary work. So I wanted to mention that. And I'll talk about what's in here. So I think the best way to think about this book, I think about the figure of Arthur and Merlin as archetypes, and the authors John and Caitlin Matthews basically say in the book too that they're really referring also to these as archetypes rather than deities. It's not that, if you want to regard these figures as deities, that's your choice, but I do regard these figures as archetypes. So the thing is to keep in mind that a lot of this is about metaphor and allegory. So if you keep that in mind, I think it leads to a better understanding of what is really talked about in this book. The rituals that I was saying that are really a type of group rituals that are in here, it's helpful to think of those as mystery plays. It's like dramatic rituals that are really types of mystery plays. So if you regard them in that way, you'd probably understand that a bit better as well. So the introduction, to start with, the introduction is called Journeying with Arthur, and the introduction alone is just so fascinating. It really is. I haven't read anything quite like it. It's the content of this book is profound at times, but it's just so fascinating. So in the introduction, part of the introduction talks about the schools of Arthurian magic. That is really interesting because it's talking about the influence of the Arthurian archetype on quite well-known esoteric schools. So that is really interesting. And it also talks about the meditations. There's meditations in this book as well, and it particularly talks about meditation and how they are regarded in this book. So that's why the introduction is important, and the meditation and ritual outline in here, it talks about how to work with the book. So that's good. Then the rest of the book is divided into 3 main parts. Which are quite substantial, but I'll give you an idea of what's in each of the parts. Part 1 is called Visions, and the subtitle is The Knowledge Papers. So you've got all about Arthur and Merlin to start with, the life of Merlin and the original Arthur, the types of legends, and there's many different versions of legends too. I think that may also surprise people. Then it talks about the mysteries of Merlin as well, and it talks about cosmology and fixed stars as well in regard to Merlin. That kind of surprised me, but fascinates me at the same time, being an astrologer. This is Arthur and the constellation of Arcturus. So it refers to Arthur as a starry king. Then it goes into Arthur and the Grail. Then it talks about temples of the Grail, and that is where it starts to go into the Grail tarot area. So the first 3 chapters of part 1 are mainly all about the Arthurian tarot and Arthurian and Merlin legends. Then it goes into the temples of the Grail, which is all to do with the, it's related to the Grail tarot. We're talking about Solomon's temple, and the whole of chapter 4 is in regard to that. Then there is a chapter 5 about the mysteries of Avalon. So you've got Merlin and Nimue, and types of initiations in not the initiations themselves, but the types of it, what they called, referred to as initiating goddesses, particular goddesses associated with Avalon. And there's a really interesting chapter called The Flower. There's an interesting section of the chapter called The Flower Bride and the Dark Goddess. Then chapter 6 is particularly interesting to me because it's about Rosicrucianism. And that chapter is called The Rose, the Vault, and the Wisdom of the Grail. So this is still about the Grail, in regard to the Grail Tarot. So you've got a section called The Secret Vault, the Temples of Light, the Castle of the Rose. So all of this is tying in Rosicrucianism with the Grail. That's very interesting, and that's probably one of my favourite chapters. Then chapter 7 is The Wounded Kings, and this talks about the Grail as a transformative vessel and the healing story. Then you go into part 2. Now, part 2 is A Year in Camelot. And the whole idea of the year in Camelot is very, very in line. It's kind of like a revisit of the Arthurian Tarot course. So by revisit, I mean it's an enhancement. So it's really good for people who have already undertaken the Hallow Quest. So the chapters continue, even though this is part 2. So you've got chapter 9, and that is called The Opening of the Ways, the mysteries, creating an Arthurian altar and temple, companions of the way, working with the archetypes, and then the year in Camelot, just like the Hallow Quest, the Arthurian Tarot course, it's divided into the 4 seasons. And this is something that I've always liked about the Hallow Quest. Always, because I personally work with a solar year. So the 4 seasons of, that's what I work with. So you start with, in this particular order, it starts with winter. It talks about the round table. There are this is where some meditations start. There's 4 different meditations here in regard to Arthur and the Green Knight and Arthur's court, the challenges of the underworld. Then you have spring, which talks about the starry realms, and this is where it's very interesting to me too, because it talks about Merlin in regard to the stars, and also talks about the Grail in the Vault of Stars. Then there is a ritual of Merlin's enclosure, which is like his tower. Then it goes into summer, which is the magic of the lake. And this mentions, talks about initiations of the lake and initiation of Taliesin. And then there are 5 meditations for the magic of the lake, and particularly to do with the suit of swords. Then you have, so summer has got quite a bit in here. Then summer goes into 3 more meditations where it's talking about the wisdom of the spear and the wounded king. And there is also, it's then going into chapter 14, Companions of the Quest. And this is to do moving away from Arthurian Tarot again and going back to the Grail Tarot. So Companions of the Quest is about Sophia and Prester John, who are, these are figures in the Grail Tarot. And these are figures of the Grail legend. We've got the healing of the Grail and the healing the wounded king. Then you go into autumn, and autumn, this is another favourite chapter of mine, the Grail, the Tarot and the tree. So the tree is Kabbalah. So I particularly like this chapter as well. So you've got the Tarot of Arthur and the Tarot of the Grail, and you've got these 2 in regard to the Tree of Life or Kabbalah, with the cards actually positioned on the Tree of Life. Then you have the Arthurian cosmos, the tarot and the tree, and working with images and archetypes. So that's one of my favourite chapters. Then you have the Hallows. There's a visualisation of the Hallows. And then particularly in regard to the Grail Tarot, you have the Road to Saris, which is a city. You have the Quest, the Three Caves, the Ship of Solomon. So that is all of part 2. The part 2 is, a year in Camelot. Then part 3 they refer to as the library. The library is your information section, which is really useful. So you've got all of the characters. It's like a kind of glossary. All of the figures they're calling the archetypal characters. So you've got all of the figures who appear in here from the Arthurian and Grail legends. There's a type of glossary and a description of each one, which is that's really useful. Then you have a section on all of the different sites in England and Wales, particularly Cornwall in England and Wales. So they're all talked about here, they're all described, all of these different sites. There is one here, Arthur's Seat in Scotland. So there is one site here that's actually in Scotland. Then you have a section on sacred oils and incense. These are special Arthurian and Grail and Merlin oils and incense. And you have invocations, and you have 4 special readings, which are legends, 4 different legends here. Wisdom of Merlin, the Round Table, Wisdom of the Grail. Then you go into seasons and festivals, which is all of the months, 12 months of the year. And that's just sort of like a guideline information for the 12 months of the year and the different themes for each month. Then the last chapter of part 3 is all about the author, Arthur Machen, and the secret school of the Grail. That is the last chapter of part 3, and then it goes into notes and further reading, which is quite an extensive bibliography covering quite a range of years of all of the different books and sources on these topics. And I had better mention at this point that this book, all of the research that went into this book, it's very clear. It's how much research has gone into this book by the authors. And they mention at the beginning of the book that it was 40 years in the making. And I can completely see that. I mean, it's really an extensive, thoroughly interesting, engrossing book. It really is quite an amazing book. There are black and white drawings, diagrams in here, the list of illustrations in the front of the book. They call them figures, and they're all numbered, so that you've got that as well. It's just a unique book. It really is a unique book. I think it's for people who want to work further. Now, I know it's called Arthurian Magic, but this is really the inner dynamic. This is for people who want to work with these inner mysteries in regard to Arthur and Merlin and the Grail. the ceremonial rituals in here are group orientated, but as I say, you can modify them for solitary work. But with the meditations in here as well, it's more to do with a inner level dynamic rather than the usual type of ceremonial magic. But I like that, and I am particularly interested in that at this time. I think it's great for inner work. I think it's a really good idea for exploring these inner levels, especially if you are a magician. I think it's really important to investigate and explore the inner levels. I think it will just enhance your own focus and ability. I think it's a really good idea to do that. If you're interested in the Arthurian and Grail mythos, I think this is definitely the place to go with this book. But you may want to complete the Hello Quest course if you wish. You don't have to. I mean, you can go straight to this book if you wish, but I must say that this book has actually helped me to appreciate and understand further the Hello Quest course. So, Arthurian Magic by John and Caitlin Matthews. It really is quite an amazing book, and I'll put some details below the video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.